But this is a great book. I thought this was a really good one. And so John is gracing us with being able to talk about output thinking and just some frameworks for entrepreneurs. John, just for your reference on some of the people that are here, average member here is doing somewhere between usually like $1 and $5 million in revenue. They have small teams in place and they're looking to scale and grow. There's some that are much bigger than that, and there's some that are maybe a little bit earlier than that. But it looks like we have a good diverse mix of different types of founders and entrepreneurs here. So it should be a good call. But let's turn it over to you and kick it off, John.
All right, sounds good. Let me get my screen going here. Um, I think that's that one. No, that's that one. There you go. Cool. So we're going to be talking today about what I call three levels of management that happen in every company, no matter how many managers you have, actually. But the first question you should always ask at things like this is, why should I believe this guy? And I want to tell you a little bit about my background. I am a lifelong SMB owner. I have literally never had a real job. Uh, in the 90s, I was a remote CEO. I had a company for 25 years, and 23 of them I lived 1,500 miles away. And that was before the internet made that really easy. During that time, I had worked myself out of a day-to-day work in the company, and so I had time to do something else and got involved in business coaching. I was one of the founders of the International Coach Federation. I was their fourth president, and they're up to like 50,000 members now. And now I'm mostly retired, except I don't have a boat, so I do still do some business coaching, and get to speak at groups like this. I'm also the author, as Trenton mentioned, of Output Thinking. Um, I'd just like to ask, what is the biggest frustration that you face as a business owners? Maybe you could put some of that in the chat. What's the thing that frustrates you most about owning a company or running a company? And I actually don't know if I can see the chat with my screen share on. Um, but I'll tell you, as you're putting that in, the thing that I hear most is has to do with employees. That's the biggest frustration that I get. And then the question becomes, well, why would you hire somebody? I mean, if that's your biggest frustration, and you'd think, well, okay, that's kind of an obvious answer why we would hire somebody. The way I like to think about it is you hire them because you need elves. And I don't mean just like Santa's elves or those kind of elves. This is a picture of illustrating a children's story called The Shoemaker and the Elves. And this poor shoemaker was down to his last piece of leather and he cut all the pieces out. He was going to put together the shoes in the morning and he laid them out on his table, all these pieces, and went to sleep. And these elves come in and they put together the shoes while he's sleeping. And it turns out they were the best shoes ever. And he was able to sell them for more money than he'd ever sold them for. And he turned his whole business around. But before he woke up, the elves disappeared. And he woke up in the morning and he said to his wife, "Oh my goodness, the elves have been here." And I want you to think, how did he know that? How could he tell they were there? Was because they had done something that he could see that was different than the way he left it. They produced shoes basically out of pieces of leather. That's what I call producing an output. And if you had people that came in the middle of the night and did a great job and went away, how would you know that they were there? How would you know if they'd done a good job, if they'd done a mediocre job, if they'd done a lousy job? That's the definition of the outputs. And that's why you hire people. You hire people to produce outputs, not to do the work. The work is what's required to produce the outputs, but the outputs are the result of the work. And here's some examples of outputs. They are obviously, you could make a thing, the shoes, make a hamburger, make a sale, make a document. That's an output. A change in status is an output. A janitor doesn't make the room, but they make the room clean. An inspector doesn't make the part, but they assign the part, either reject it or accept it. They change their status. Behaviors are outputs. Decisions are outputs. Solving problems are outputs. And even building relationships or maintaining relationships are outputs. And those outputs all have properties along with them. So properties of outputs can be the quantity of them, how many shoes you make, or the quality of them, the frequency that they happen with, the training or the certification that's required, the capacity of somebody to do so many outputs per shift or per month or for whatever, and obviously the cost. And so a lot of these things are the reason that we hire people, but we think about it almost too often as, oh, I want them to do the work. But that's not really the reason. It's the result of that work. And so this is the kind of thing I go into um, in the book Output Thinking, which I hope you will all buy many, many copies of and give them to all your managers, uh, but away from our commercial now. If the reason we hire people is to produce outputs, then the question comes, what's the definition of management? We've got people, they're doing all these outputs that we hired them for. What do we need managers for? Well, management is actually getting those outputs produced through other people. And so what I want to do today is lay out a framework that you can use to think about management and to think about how you can build your team so that they produce the right outputs and how much management is necessary. The number one rule of management is don't be like Larry. And I don't mean this Larry. Larry is a guy that I knew years ago who had a framing crew. So they would go in to a subdivision that was building houses. The foundations were already laid, and they would put up the 2x4 walls and framing for the roofs, and then they would move on. And Larry at the time had one crew, and he was managing them, and he was taking home about $500 a week. This I did the math one time. This was many, many years ago. It was about $200,000 a year in today's money. So he wasn't doing too bad. But he thought, if I get two crews, I'm taking home $1,000 a week. If I get two crews, I could probably do better. So he got two crews, and sure enough, soon he was taking home only $750 a week. And he said, well, that doesn't make any sense. I'll get three crews. So he got three crews, and he was only taking home $500 a week. And he was missing. It wasn't because his people were lazy. It wasn't because he couldn't do the sales. It wasn't because they were like, trying to slough off when he wasn't around. It was because he was missing the fact that he was actually producing the outputs of a manager while he was on the job with his crew. And because didn't realize that's what he was doing, he had assumed that if he left, went to another job site with the other crew, they would do just as well without him. And that wasn't the case, because one of the outputs of management is managers empower people to do better work. I will leave it up to you to figure out in this picture who's the manager and who's the worker, who's empowering who. I'm not quite sure. But when I say empower people, it's not just the giving them authority, but it's actually setting up the infrastructure for people to succeed and for people to do great work. So that is one of the outputs, is that you have a better team. So in Larry's case, as he's on a job site with a crew, he's doing several things. One is he's doing quality control. If something's a little out of whack, he'll say something right away. If there's scheduling that needs to be done, he'll work that out. If he's making sure that they have the right supplies, he's focusing on them on what they need to do today. So maybe he found out that something's going to change in the next day or two, and he said, hey guys, we got to work on this side of the building today instead of that side. He's doing all that to make them do a better job. But the most important output of a manager is this: to define the expected outputs of the team in ways that are visible and measurable, so that there's an agreement with everybody about what does a good job look like. If I were to talk to your people and say, how do you know you're doing a good job? And if I were to talk to their boss and say, how do you know they're doing a good job? Would they have the exact same answer? If not, then the manager hasn't done the job of explaining what outputs are expected in measurable, visible ways. One of the most fun jobs I ever had was a guy, I think he was the only person who ever read my website, but he emailed me from the website and said, "Hey, I need to talk to you about this." And he was running a company over in the Netherlands. He was 32 years old. He had about 50 or 60 employees. He was probably the oldest person in the company. And he said, "I don't know what I don't know, and I want to make sure that I'm doing this right," because he had actually sold his company and he wanted to make sure he got his earnout. So I went over there and I did what I call a systems analysis, where I go in and talk to all the managers and look at what systems are working well, which ones are broken, which ones are going to break as the company grows, et cetera. And two questions that I asked everybody was, how do you know you're doing a good job? And how does your boss know you're doing a good job? Well, I had asked Sebastian, who was my client, who was the CEO, I said, how do you know your people are doing a good job? And he said, well, we're hitting all our numbers. I said, okay, great. So as I talked to everybody else in the company, and I said, how do you know you're doing a good job? And how does your boss know you're doing a good job? Nobody said, oh, I'm hitting my numbers. That never came up. There was a little disconnect between how he thought of them doing a good job and how they thought of themselves as doing a good job. For the most part, the company was doing pretty well. There were a couple of deficiencies that we came up with, but what I mean by an agreement is exactly knowing what a good job looks like so that they can judge themselves if they're doing it well or not. When you have that agreement, then any kind of performance review is never a surprise. If performance reviews are a surprise, then there was usually something lacking in their understanding of what a good job looks like. And I equate that to, if you're trying out for the Olympics, let's say you're a swimmer and you're trying out for the Olympics, you know exactly what time you need to hit to make the team. So you do your thing and you get out of the water and you look up at the clock and the number's right there. Your boss isn't going to say, well, you did a good job, but your attitude's not great, or you're not really a team player, or it's like, this is the output. I made it or I didn't. That's what I mean by agreement. When you find, as a manager, as a boss, as a business owner, when you find yourself thinking, I would have assumed that I didn't have to say that, or I would have expected people would just know that they should do this, or I shouldn't have to say this, then that's an indication that as a manager, you may not have been clear enough in describing the outputs that you hired somebody for. And one of the things that you find is when you start looking at these outputs, that many of them, most people do multiple outputs. Unless you're just standing at a widget machine all day making the same widgets, you're doing a lot more than just one set of outputs. And many of those outputs are not related to the actual job that you're hired for. You may have a guy who's a mechanic in your shop, but he's also the one that knows how to fix the router when the internet goes down or something like that. Or you may have a bookkeeper who's also a really terrific proofreader. And so you send them, all your brochures or your websites and things like that to just double check before it goes out. Well, those outputs are very necessary, but they're not exactly related to that job. And as a manager, you want to know that that's an output that they're good at and it needs to be done, and so that they have the time to do that. So the most important thing of a manager, the most important output, is to define those outputs for other people very clearly. It's also a good way to promote somebody. Somebody says, well, I'd like to move up into this other job. And you can go, great. If you want to be good, if you want to be promoted to that job, you have to be good at these outputs. Here's the 5 or 6 outputs that we need for somebody in that job. And it looks like you're good at 4 of them. Why don't we work on the next 2, and then we can consider you for a promotion? And again, there's an agreement there. They know how they're doing. You know how they're doing. So So that's the most important output of a manager. But wait, there's more. Let's take a look at this guy. What's up with him? Here's this crew. They're all big, husky fellows. First of all, he's smaller than they are. He's facing the other direction. He's not even looking where they're looking. He doesn't have any oars, and his mother dresses him funny. He's not wearing the same clothes. Well, what's he doing? He's actually going forward. He's actually looking forward. He's looking in the direction that the boat's going, and he is making sure that they do the work to go in the right direction. And the reason that he's small is because they want to get the lightest guy doing that job.
Do you mind taking trash out of the car rather than leaving it?
Because he's the one saying, "Oh, we need to pull a little bit to the left, we need to pull a little bit to the right, we need to pull faster, slower, whatever." He's aligning all the work of those other guys with the goal of getting the boat across the finish line. So that's another output of management, is to align people's work with the company's direction. And so one of the ways you can sum up the manager's output is they set the direction. They allocate resources. If we say we're going to go in this direction as a company, well, then we need the budget. We need the number of people. We need the right equipment. We need all that stuff. That's the manager's job. And we need to uplift people's abilities. We need to do, what that horse and the mechanic were doing, helping people perform their job better, and align their work so that it goes in the direction of the company. And generally, what I say is this breaks out into 3 levels of management. There's top management outputs, middle management outputs, and team leader, or the bottom level outputs. And every company of every size needs all 3 of these outputs. But in most companies, particularly the top one and often the middle one, are not full-time jobs. So they are often different levels of management outputs done by maybe the same person, which is why people are wearing many hats. And I'm sure you notice in your life as running a business, you're wearing different hats all the time. And often in a company of the size that we're talking about, the work that we do, the outputs that we produce, is not always even management. It's not always a full-time job. Sometimes we're actually out there doing sales. Sometimes we're out there making product. Sometimes we're out there crunching the numbers, doing other outputs that workers will do as our company grows. And this same thing was true with Larry. He was the team leader when he was with his crew. He was their team leader, but that wasn't a full-time job for a guy with one crew. But he wasn't just standing around with his elbow on the shovel smoking cigarettes. He was actually pounding nails and cutting wood at the same time, because that wasn't a full-time job for him. One of the ways to look at the distinctions between these 3, particularly in a construction company, but this will apply to any company, is that the top management determines which projects we take on. The middle level outputs, the middle managers keep the project on budget, and the team leader keeps the crew on task. That's the way I've heard it explained for a construction crew. In most SMB level companies, the determination of which projects we take on, which direction we go, what our strategy is, that doesn't change very often. If we are running a company, and usually that's limited by geography, it's limited by our skill set. If you have a plumbing company around a certain city, it's not very likely that you're going to all of a sudden jump to be nationwide, or that you're going to be able to say, oh, well, besides plumbing, we also do cabinetry, or we do this, that, or the other thing. I mean, that does happen, but it's not very common. So these top management outputs don't happen very frequently. The middle level management of how do we produce the resources for this, that's usually done in a SMB level company on an ad hoc basis. Or we have this project, we need another truck, or we need another crew, or whatever we do, we get it. In a bigger company, that could be somebody's full-time job, or a whole team could be doing that full-time. But the team leader outputs, that is critical in an SMB level company. people need that support of getting the right thing done, giving them the tools, the training, the quality control, all the other things they need to do their best work. And it's not about making them work harder. It's really about empowering them or giving them the infrastructure that they need to do their best work. So I'd like to take a minute and hear from you. What are your takeaways of this so far? You can unmute yourself and just shout out. Sounds like I put everybody to sleep. I've done a good job.
I mean, I've read the book, so it's a little bit similar to what you have in the book. But for me, it is, I think a lot of us, especially as managers, early managers, um, people please at times and aren't super clear on the direction that we need to go. And so this thought process of really being clear on our outputs and directions for these people is interesting. I don't know if you saw as well, John, you had a bunch of comments at the beginning of people that you called it, right? As you said, like most of the time it's employees. Pretty much everyone in here said hiring, one said time management, another one said employee management, finding quality people, another one said trusting people what to do, another one said visibility and employees not bringing me top issues, another one said employees aligning around vision. So everyone said exactly what you said as you had mentioned it. So I think this is for sure interesting.
Yeah, and you hit on a good point there, Trenton. We want people to like us. I mean, that's normal. Um, and one of the things we're afraid of is being a micromanager. And we don't want to specify that level of detail. And so we just say, well, you just need to do this thing. And we don't specify, well, the thing needs to be this color or this size or needs to be done by Thursday or whatever, because we feel like, well, we don't want to be that guy or that gal who's the micromanager. And I think we have misunderstood that term micromanagement. Here's my definition of it. If you have an output or some property of that output that is actually required in order to serve our customers better, and you explain it, then that's not micromanagement. So let's say you need to get certain information to the finance department every Thursday at noon. Well, there's a reason that it has to be there by noon so that they can cut the invoices on Friday so that the customers can pay in 30 days so that we all have the money to pay our payroll, all that. There's a whole chain of events there that is probably obvious to you, but not obvious to other people. And if you explain it, it's not being micromanagement. Now, if you have something that you want them to do in a certain way that's not relevant to ultimately serving customers, then yeah, that's micromanaging. But if there's a reason that it needs to be done, then go ahead and share that with them. And don't be afraid of micromanaging. Who else has got a takeaway from today?
I can add to that. I found that I had superintendents and project managers for my home building company, and I found that when they had a problem, I would ask them, well, what are our options? And they would present a couple, three options that they found through the subcontractor to solve the problem. And then I would say simply, what do you think is the best one? And they would say it, and I would say, yeah, sounds good to me. And eventually they stopped coming to me.
Yeah.
And I would hear about it later, and they did it, and it was done. So I gave them ownership of it.
Yeah. Yeah. They got to learn how you thought about those outputs and anything, there may be a case where you'd say, we can't do that with that subcontractor because some history or some things going on. And that's because of your position in the company. And as soon as you explain that, then they can take it and run with it. That's a great
It was
thing.
always about the customer first anyway, so it worked out. And once they understood that, they can make the decision on their own.
That's great. Anybody else? So I'd like you to now think about who are the managers in your company and what level of management do they each provide? So which ones do the top level management of setting strategy, of setting direction, deciding which projects we take on, which ones we don't, or when we take them on? Who does the middle management piece of once we have a project and we've decided we're going to do it, uh, we now have to allocate resources. We have to allocate a budget. We have to maybe move people around from this project to that project. Maybe we have to hire more people or invest in more equipment or whatever. Who makes those level decisions? And who are the team leaders in your organization? And how many people share multiple hats in that regard? You ultimately, as the owner, are responsible for all of it, but on an ongoing basis, how much of it do you do? And in thinking through this, can anybody see any gaps in their management structure?
I, yes, I'm curious, John. So a lot of the people in this call are earlier, and maybe haven't been able to hire their managers yet. What's your recommendation for that if you're like in between and you need to hire, but you're not quite at that stage, or maybe you're hiring more um, lower level employees first?
Yeah, so if you're, I think what you're referring to is the team leader level of management, and you're them. You are them if you haven't hired anybody else in that position. But the team leader in most teams is somebody who actually does some of the work as an individual contributor as well as organizing the team. So on a construction site, they used to be called foremen because it used to be mostly men, but they're also called team leaders. They're in retail, they're often called supervisors. It's somebody who's doing the work, but also has a little more authority. Usually at that level, people don't have the authority to hire or fire people, but they have the authority to say, hey, let's focus on this today, or this job was done a little bit sloppy yesterday. Let's clean it up now. Quality control, that kind of thing. So if you don't have people in that position, you are that person. And your challenge is to budget your time so that you can do that with your team and get them off to a good start and then still do the other stuff that's on your plate. So one of the tools for that is usually a daily huddle at the beginning of the day or the beginning of a shift. You say, get everybody together. Say, okay, this is what we're going to accomplish today. Anybody see any problems on the horizon that I should know about now? And then the next day you say, this is what we said we're going to do yesterday. How did we do? Okay, what are we going to do today? Anybody see any problems? And you make those same things in a daily huddle. It can usually take 10 or 15 minutes is all it takes. But if you get them going, then you've got the team going, and then you can spend the rest of your time doing other things if you're not going to be working with them. Uh, does that answer the question? And then
Yep.
like I said, most of these in smaller companies are not full-time positions. But as you get a team together, what you might find is, oh, a team can sometimes be two people. If it's a typically home service companies, there's maybe two people in a truck, and that's all that you have room for on a team. But one person is in charge of, oh, we have to get there on time, we have to pick up, we have to clean up, we have to get to the next job on time. Uh, After that, you might need another crew. There are other teams where they can grow to be 4, 5, 6 people, maybe. Most of them don't get much bigger than that before you actually putting somebody else over the team. So, how many of you are doing all three levels of management all the time?
I'm in a new one now, so it's just me anyway. But
There you
I'm
go.
gonna change that pretty quick.
Solopreneur, you're doing everything.
Yeah.
So you don't have the biggest frustration of employees. You don't have that. Good for you.
No, it's only me to blame.
Yeah. I used one of my first companies was like that, and I had a terrible boss. But that's good. As the company grows, what you find is that some of the people that you're managing are also managing others. So you will be managing managers. And here's a tool that I got from Mark Brooks, who was the president and COO of Permanent Equity, Brent Beshore's group. And he gave this talk at Main Street Summit, which is a great conference if any of you can make it there. Look me up, I'll see you there. But what he said was put a box around what your managers can do, and then anything within that box they can do without talking to you. It's only when they need to move outside of that box do they need to talk to you. And his box was the vision and values of the company, the policies of the company, the budget, and capital investment. You may have a different box around your managers, but he said, so if somebody wants to do something that's within that budget, they can just do it. If they need to go outside the budget, then we need to talk. Not that they can't do it, but we need to talk about it first. And the story that he gave was, if you can imagine a playground, a kid's playground in the middle of a city, and there's roads on all four sides. Well, those kids aren't going to be playing at the edge of the playground. They're kind of going to be huddled up in the middle. They're going to stay away from the roads. They're not going to be kicking their balls that hard. They're not going to be running right to the edge. But if you put a fence around that playground, now they can take over the whole thing, and they can play all end to end. They kick hard and all that kind of good stuff. That's what that does for your managers, is empowers them by putting that box around them. And like I said, these four things are what he used in his box with his managers, but you may have some different ones here. Now I want to share with you a quote that is very inspiring, a very stimulating quote, and it will absolutely ruin your business if you act on it. It's a quote by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, who, among other things, was a pilot in the French Air Force in World War II, and he was author of a children's book called The Little Prince. I don't know how any of that made sense for being a business guy, but this is the quote that he shares. And he said, if you want to build up a ship, don't go drum up men to gather wood, divide the work, give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. And can you imagine if we tried to build houses this way? And we said, hey guys, we don't need blueprints. You guys I got all my subcontractors here. You guys are really smart people. I'm not going to give you a schedule. I'm not going to give you blueprints. But I do have a picture of the house. It's a really cool house. Look at how amazing this is. Look at the views from the backyard. Look at what the bathrooms look like. It's really amazing. But you guys figure out your schedule and all that. I don't think those houses would get up very well. And the reason is, what he's talking about here is leadership. And he's saying, you don't want to manage people, just get them excited and you'll be good. But there's really a very serious difference between leadership and management. As we've been talking about, management is getting work done through other people. It's getting those outputs that are needed to be produced through other people's work. Leadership is getting people to follow you. And you know why, when you see birds flying in these V's, there's almost always, particularly with geese, there's almost always more, one of those V's is longer than the other. Anybody know why? It's because there's more geese on that side. Okay, I'm almost done. But leadership means people are following you. And that's what it means. And the way you get people to follow you, the Gallup organization did a study on leaders. And they found that there are leaders with boring personalities, with charismatic personalities. There's introverts, there's extroverts. They come in all sizes, shapes, and flavors. But they all had two things in common. One is that they saw a vision of where the company was going, and that they repeated that vision over and over and over again, so in such a way that everybody understood their part in that vision, and that inspired people to follow them in direction of that vision. So that's what Saint-Exupéry was talking about when he said, yearn for the vast and endless sea. That's the vision of where we're going. And you do definitely need leadership, and you definitely want leadership. It's an interesting analogy if you look at it in a sports team. The coach or the manager is the person on the sidelines telling people where to go, building the game plan, moving players in and out of the field. That's the management. The leaders are the team captains who are actually voted on, elected by the team themselves. Those are the leaders. And they're elected as captains because of their leadership, because of their ability to inspire people and keep people going for that vision. So leadership and management are two different things. If you are the owner of the company, you probably need to do both. So one of the things I would change about the quote that we just saw, if you want to build a ship, do drum up the men to gather wood, divide the work, give orders. And when I say when you use this quote, give orders, I don't mean being command and control, but set the direction of where we're headed. But also teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. Take the vision of your company and where you're going and use that repeatedly to inspire people, but also put the management structure in place so that they know how to achieve that vision. And that's where we're going with this company. And your vision, it doesn't have to be, Steve Jobs' famous quote is he wanted to put a dent in the universe. And that's great. But, some of our businesses aren't like that. So, you could have a vision of, we make the best damn pizza in town. Everything you do in your company is to serve a customer. So your vision has to be something about the customer, how it's going to affect the customer, change the customer, how it's going to impact the customer. And maybe the impact is greater. Maybe you are building something that's going to put a dent in the universe. So that's great. Whatever it is, keep that vision in front of people all the time as a leader, but then also make sure that they are supported and empowered and uplifted to do the best work they can do as a manager. So thank you. That's the end of our 3 levels. This is where you can find me, ceobootcamp.com. Send me an email if you have further comments and questions, if I can help in any way. As I said before, I do business coaching. My schedule's pretty full right now, but I always have a slot where I give free coaching sessions, and you can find that on that website too, ceobootcamp.com. Happy to do that for people. So thank you very much.
Yeah, this is great. Anyone have any questions for John before we jump off here?
Good. Thank you, John.
And my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, John.
John, this was great.
Yeah. Yeah, appreciate it.
All right.
Cool. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. We'll share this with the group too.
Yeah. Thank
I
you.
read a lot of business books. This is definitely one that definitely made me think differently. So I appreciate you coming on and talking with us about it. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
See you guys. Bye.